Well, hey everybody, and welcome back to Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. I feel like we are in for something really special today. I know I say that a lot, but this time I really mean it. We are about to have a conversation with David Weiss. David is a prolific writer, theologian, and poet. He's committed to doing public theology around issues of ecology, sexuality, justice, diversity, and peace. And David is the creator of the website Frontal Faith, where you can find much of his work and further connect with him. And trust me, after this conversation, that's exactly what you're going to want to do. Welcome, David. How's it going?
It's going well. Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you. It's just a real pleasure to have you here. I will say, when I describe you as prolific, I do not think I was underselling. On your website, Frontal Faith, there is an awful lot of content.
Yes, I've been blogging consistently for 5 years now. There's a lot of stuff up there. And I think one of the things that distinguishes my writing is that I'm committed to being honest, authentic, vulnerable. So the writing, I think, builds a bridge between me and readers quite often.
I could not have described your writing better myself. I've read a number of your essays. You were kind enough to send some of them over, but then I went to the website and I kept reading. And vulnerable, extremely personal, extremely human is the sense that I got from your writing. AI could not do what you do. I think they probably want to steal what you do, but I don't think they'd be very successful. How did you come to find and embrace writing as your medium for communicating?
That's an interesting question, because I think I would say that words embraced me first. I grew up in a family where my parents read to me every day. I mean, read to us, so there were 4 kids in the family, but I grew up kind of with bedtime stories and words dancing around me all the time, and I was enchanted by them. And in some way that they found me almost before I found them. And eventually, I think I was maybe 8 or 10 years old, I discovered that I had the ability to enchant words. I could write poetry. And my early poems, they were simple, silly things, but I wrote poems for my parents and my grandparents on special occasions. And what I discovered, even with those simple, silly poems, was that I had this ability to summon a whirlwind of words in my mind, and I could watch the words swirling around, and I could pick this word and pick that word and invite them down onto the page and see what happened. And it was magical for me. It was joyful, and for a variety of reasons, family expectations, social pressures, it was decades before I really embraced writing as my reason for being. It's weird, because I look at myself now and I think, how did it take me so long to reach that point? But I was thinking about that before this interview, that in some ways it was impossible for me for many years to imagine being in a committed relationship with words and living happily ever after.
Wow.
It wasn't there.
Well, we won't explore the rationale for that in this conversation, but even just from the way you describe your relationship with words and them dancing around, I'm like, oh, I would like more, please. And so I want to explore that in the future. But while we're kind of delving into your past just a little bit, just touching on it, I'm wondering if you can recall the first bit of writing you did that felt important to you, because you could have, you could write about anything. It's very clear from the outset that you have a way with words. And you could write fan fiction, you could write romance novels, but you're writing things that seem important to you. And so what's the first thing?
Yeah, so I'm going to say, and I wrote a lot of things that I really liked, that were, in a sense, important to me. But the first piece that was important in italics, in bold print, I know exactly. February 1997, I was a graduate student at Notre Dame. I was studying Christian ethics. I was 37 years old. I'd written a lot of stuff by that time. But here's what happened. So I had, a decade earlier, I had been a student at Lutheran Seminary, and at a Lutheran Seminary, I had a number of friends who were gay and lesbian.
Okay.
It's a hard thing to be back then in a Lutheran seminary, so they were closeted, or if they were out kind of in peril of not getting ordained. But I developed close friendships with them, and I had become a very committed ally, but not exactly a public one. And at Notre Dame, as a grad student, I would pick up and I would read the Notre Dame newspaper. It came out daily, and it was filled at least once a week with a letter to the editor or an opinion piece that bashed gay people.
Wow.
Kind of dripping with Catholic rhetoric and whatnot. And I would cringe, I would feel uncomfortable, and yet I would say to myself, David, you're here as a grad student, you're here to get your degree and be gone, and it's like, this is really an argument within the Catholic traditions, not my business to stick my nose in it, and I would move on. And then in 1996, I started teaching undergrad students at Notre Dame. And suddenly, this sea of anonymous faces became kids that I recognized, that I knew by name. And I would see these letters come up in the newspaper, and I could not help but wonder whether one of my students felt targeted by those words. And so the restlessness increased. But what happened in February was something different. An anonymous letter was published by a senior. He titled it Living in Fear, and he wrote about how he had come to Notre Dame 4 years earlier. He was going to graduate in 3 months, and during his entire time at Notre Dame, he had not told a single person, not a roommate, not a fellow student, not a coach, not a mentor, not a professor, nobody, that he was gay. He was going to graduate without having spoken that fundamental truth of who he was to a single person. 4 years living in fear.
Wow.
And that night, it was like a dam broke inside me. I read the letter late at night at home, and I sat down at my keyboard. I still get emotional talking about this. And I typed through the night with tears streaming down my face. I wrote an open letter back to him titled Words Offered at the End of the Day to an Unknown Friend Living in Fear. And somewhere near the start of that letter, I said, I see now that if God remains silent in the face of your anguish, it is because I would not lend God the use of my words. Well, here they are. And I ransacked the Bible for images left and right of a God who welcomes outcasts, a God whose love is boundless, and I wept for hours. 2 weeks later, that letter appeared. I was a public ally. I never met the kid who wrote this letter, never contacted me. It appeared in the same publication. But that piece was the first time that I was swallowed by the power and importance of what I could do with words. It was like that was the night that I realized that I was made for words, and I needed to figure out what to do with that. And it turned out I spent the next 20 years driven by work that focused on creating a welcome and affirming place for LGBTQ people in church communities. I wrote about it, I talked about it, I traveled made presentations at conferences, and it was, in some ways, at least it all started with an anonymous letter that drove me into tears that opened up a floodgate of words. And it was the piece that was important.
That's an incredible, empathetic, magical, magnetic act, very human act, a very inspiring way to use your gifts to help other people. That's beautiful. And I can't help but hear that it wasn't until you had a sense of responsibility for your students that your perspective changed a bit, where you thought, oh, I need to do something here. And it sounds like maybe that echoed into your relationship with your own children, particularly between the church as an organization and your children. Because you wrote an essay that went on to become your most popular essay so far, called Giving Up on Church for My Children. And I believe that took you about 6 years from start to finish the process. So would you mind just telling us a little bit about that essay?
Yes, yeah. So that's an interesting connection that you make. I think I had not thought until just now about the way that empathy sparked what happened with that essay. Of course, it's at the heart of it, but I hadn't used that word for it. My most read essay, I hesitate to use the word my most popular because it got some negative feedback as well. But I started thinking just a couple days ago about this essay as sort of, it is my own little personal cicada, because it was actually a 7.5-year gap.
Chirp, chirp.
I put the title down in a Word document, September 2015, and I had scribbled down a couple opening paragraphs, and then, like a cicada, it burrowed into the dirt, and it never went away, but I did not come back to it for 7.5 years, and suddenly it emerged, and it had wings, and it buzzed, and whatnot. So what happened with that? Well, so I'm trained as a theologian. I spent 20 years teaching at the college level, and I was a good teacher. I was passionate. I was insightful.
You seem like a really good teacher.
And I know that there were students who found their faith incredibly deepened because of me. And it was heartbreaking that I was not able to do that for my own children. Now, there are a host of reasons. There were family dynamics at play. There was a divorce involved. There was geographical relocations. There's the general social pressure that their generation is less religious than my generation. So there's a whole bunch of things at play. And yet, for me, it wasn't simply that church was a weekly habit of mine. Church was my life. Church was my work, thinking about God, talking about God. And what I was seeing play out with my own kids is that just didn't connect for them. And 2015 was the year my daughter, Susanna, the younger of the two, was a sophomore in college. And it was at that point that I first allowed myself to say out loud, what if church is not going to work for them? What if I need to not keep inviting them to church every time they're home for one reason or another? What if I need to let go of that dream? And Ben is 9 years older than Susanna. He had left church earlier, but I think I held out hope that, maybe Susanna is going to do it. So initially, the title was, It's Time for Me to Give Up on Church for Them. And I made peace with that. And then 7 years later, what happens in the meantime, I changed the focus of my theological work from welcome to LGBTQ folks to thinking and writing about climate change. It was an interest of mine 20 years earlier in grad school, and something just felt like it was time to go back to that. So I went back to that, and for the next 7 years then, my blog and my professional work focused on writing at the intersection of climate change and Christian faith and trying to help churches imagine how they respond.
Yes.
That was the first thing that happened. Second thing that happened, sometime around 2018, 2019, because of my work in that area, I began to have serious doubts about whether we were going to successfully meet the challenge of climate change. I went into it thinking, I'm going to champion this, and I'm going to be one of many people, and we're going to turn the tide.
Yeah.
That confidence lapsed. And then the third thing, last August, my mom died. It was not a tragic, earth-shattering death. In many ways, the last years of her life that she spent battling Alzheimer's, that was the tragic part. When death came, death was peaceful, it was a relief. But because it was a parent's death, it asked me to reassess my life and to ask myself, we all have got a finite number of years. Am I doing what matters most to me?
Yeah.
And the answer that came up to me very quickly is, I am pouring my heart into this work around climate, and my kids could care less about what I write because I am writing a language that means nothing to them. So when I finally wrote this essay, there's a sentence in it. It's the most clear-eyed and teary-eyed sentence in the essay. It basically says, if the language that I know best no longer reaches those I love most dearly, how can I not go in search of other words? I don't know what those words are, but it is that same empathy from February 1997 that says, I need to do something to build a bridge here. And so beginning in March, I simply decided that I need to immerse myself outside the Christian church rather than inside. It doesn't mean that I don't have reverence for God. It doesn't mean that I don't still think of Jesus as somebody that I admire deeply. But I need to find language that is not bound by that universe, because that's not the universe that my kids live in.
And you have some, I would say, gentle critiques, constructive criticism for the church as an organization. I would not say that the essay is written to the church, but there are sentences that are about the church in some ways. For instance, you say that you hope your children can find communities of common cause centered on an ecological and humanist ethic of humility, justice, and care, which would seem to imply that the church as an organization is not hitting at least some of those somewhat specific elements. And so did you have a community in mind when you wrote that sentence?
I think I had an ideal community in mind, maybe not a community that I had met yet, although I would say that you think about, those community of common cause. I think there are churches that aspire to be that. And I think there are churches that they lift up principles of mercy, justice, care, ecological concern. And I think that those aspirations are sincerely held. I think there's a gap between principles and embodiment in a lot of communities, not simply Christian churches, in a lot of communities that have aspirations, because whether we like to acknowledge it or not, we live in a culture which day in and day out, both explicitly and quietly, works to subvert those principles. So I would say I have I have found I've been involved in a couple churches that have aspired to be that sort of community of common cause. Imperfectly, but have aspired to it. And I hope that I can find a community that embodies that more vigorously for me. I hope someday my kids find that as well. As I mentioned in the essay right now, I'm kind of flirting with Unitarians.
Oh, okay.
Because it's a community that I can be part of that includes Sunday morning reverence and fellowship and is not tied to Christian language. I will confess as well that I have found a Lutheran church in my neighborhood, Zion Lutheran in the Midway in St. Paul. It's a little tiny congregation that has found some extraordinary ways of being a community of common cause in their neighborhood. They have an active food shelf, they have community meals, they have Friday evening community music offerings, book club that is open to anybody, and it's a little tiny church. But for me, it is an example of what a church could be if it chose to be. And so once a month or so, I walk through their doors. Even though I gave up on church for my children, I still sample a little bit myself now and then.
Now, one of the reasons I was interested in whether or not you had identified a community is that in your writing focused on climate change now, you really stare it in the face. You don't mince a lot of words. You know, and towards the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about words dancing in the sky, and you don't get the words dancing in the sky vibe from your most recent ratings on climate change. In fact, the terms are pretty stark, referring at some points to social and ecological collapse, or maybe societal and ecological collapse. And I think ecological collapse is difficult to dispute. You know, you ask a scientist, they'll tell you all about it. But I'm not sure that the link between ecological collapse and societal collapse is one that people are intuitively like putting together. And so I'm hoping you can connect some of those dots for us.
I will try. So I want to, this is a huge topic. I'm not a scientist, I'm a theologian. And so I excavate this territory looking for meaning. And yet, you're absolutely right. My writing around this is stark. It doesn't mince words. It stares it in the face. And I would say it does that because as I did reading in the area, I found collapse staring me in the face.
Yeah.
And I had to decide, do I blink? Do I, somehow escape from it? How do I respond to it? So, here are a couple things that I want to say. First off, on my blog, there are two places that people can go if they kind of want to read the fuller picture of this. One is a short series that I wrote in, I think it was 2021, under the heading Dark Hope. And so if you go to my blog and you just search Dark Hope, it will take you to those essays. The other one is a long essay that I wrote in early 2022. It begins with the words on edge. And if you search on edge, you'll get kind of the full picture.
We're going to take a break so everyone can relax. But then we'll be right back with David Weiss. Thanks. Well, welcome back to Bottomless Coffee with Jerome, everybody. We are here talking with writer and poet David Weiss. Okay. This is a little bit different from what our first segment was about. But, you know, this podcast came about during the COVID era. Well, this is the show, but the show is from the podcast. And I got so stir crazy that I kind of became creative, right? It sounds like your creativity was a little bit different in that it got you at a younger age. But I'm really interested in your COVID experience. and what it was like for you.
Okay. So COVID, it disrupted my life. I will begin by confessing this is kind of embarrassing.
Okay.
I am a devout introvert. And most
An
days,
introverted writer, you say. I'm
most
shocked.
days, social interaction is a stress for me. And so in a strange way, as COVID descended upon us and there was all of this stay home, be
I know where
safe,
this is going.
I thought to myself, this is my cup of tea. I will be, and so the embarrassment is that clearly for the people who had COVID, this was no cup of tea at all. And in the early days of the pandemic, I'm not sure that any of us grasped early on how deep, dark, and long this was going to be. But I remember that it felt kind of fun at first.
Sure.
And as a writer, I do most of my work from home. But when COVID hit, my wife Margaret started working from home as well. We occasionally rent out a back room in our upstairs bedroom in our house, usually short term, and we had rented it to a housemate, I want to say December of 2019, who had planned spring of 2020 to find a place of her own, and then everything shut down. And so suddenly our 6-month housemate became a 2-year housemate, and we became a 3-person pod during that time.
Okay.
How else did COVID impact me? So one thing, so obviously I wrote about it, but the other thing that impacted, I think, even significantly the writing that I did is that, so my wife Margaret, as you know, works for the City of Minneapolis Department of Public Health, and she was deeply involved in the city's COVID response. And one of the first roles that she played was helping to coordinate the city's outreach to homeless encampments at the start of COVID. And so we would regularly, for several weeks, we would drive around to the different encampments to check on the condition and supply level of the sanitation stations and the portable toilets that were placed out for these folks. And in a way that I don't think that I consciously processed at the time, but when I look back, I can see how deeply it affected the way that I wrote about it, is that I became keenly, grimly, grittily aware of the price that COVID was exacting from the people who were at the margins of society.
Oh, yes.
Suddenly, no malls are open, no libraries are open, and where do you go to the bathroom? Where do you wash your hands? The other thing, of course, was connected with that is throughout the entire COVID experience, Margaret's days were long.
I was going to say.
She had steady income the whole time. She had meaningful work the whole time. But for me, as somebody who's writing about COVID, to be living side by side with somebody who was living the response to COVID long hours, day after day, I also became keenly aware of the human cost of COVID, even to the people who are doing the good response to it.
Yeah.
So
I serve on the Public Health Advisory Committee for the City of Minneapolis for just a couple more months. And your wife does take part there. She facilitates. And through that committee, I got to speak with other members, other employees of the health department who were doing like the actual on the ground work. And it's just, I don't want to say there was a sense of ingratitude from people, but I think a sense of not really appreciating everything that people are doing just to keep things running. Like you mentioned having checked bathrooms. If you go to next door, there's some conversation about whether or not bathrooms should be provided for people. And I'm like, well, where would you like them to use the restroom? Like on the sidewalk in front of your house, for goodness sake. Yeah. There's just basic it's a lack of empathy, is what it is. It's a basic lack of empathy. And I distinctly remember in one meeting thinking, well, what can we do to help honor all of the people who have gone through such extraordinary lengths on our behalf? Because, obviously I'm talk show podcast host. I'm not in public health. I'm the guy, I'm in the meeting. I'm like, well, surely we can light the bridge. Surely we can have a pizza party. We can do something. And I don't know if we ever really expressed our gratitude to people. The pandemic's not over, but it's been 3 years, and that's an awful long time to not say thank you. Right. I don't know if we have really given thought to whether or not we should be going back to the way that things have been done. Circling back to the environment, during my time, I saw bald eagles flying around the city of Minneapolis, for goodness sake. Did you encounter any environmental changes that you thought were positive due to the lockdown?
I think there was a stillness.
Yes.
Even in the urban areas, there was a stillness. And I think there also was perhaps a deeper appreciation or savoring of the outdoors, because it was one of those safe places to be. You could go to a state park or a national park, even a regional park, even walking around Como Lake. You could go and you could social distance, and yet you could still feel and be, gratefully aware of the gift of the world around us.
Yeah. And you'd also mentioned previously your mother, and we don't have to dive into it too deeply, but in your writing, you at least briefly reference that there is a period of separation between yourself and your mother when you weren't able to see her. Do you mind just talking about that a little bit?
Yeah. It was a hard time, because those were the years, the early years of COVID were the years that Alzheimer's was stealing my mom. Maybe started just prior to COVID came down, that her forgetfulness and kind of her memory lapses were beginning to reach a point that you realize that this just isn't forgetfulness. It's something more, and it's beginning to impinge on her ability to actually have a conversation, to remember clearly reference points in people's lives. And so during that, it was probably a year and a half that I went without actually physically seeing her. Telephone conversations were a losing battle. She couldn't read lips, she couldn't see faces. And so it was a weird shift that my mom is much more the conversationalist than my dad is.
Okay.
And so if I make a weekend phone call 10 years ago, my mom carries 80% of the conversation and my dad is there in the background. But during COVID, as my mom loses her ability to hold conversations, especially if she can't see you, my dad becomes the conversationalist, and my mom is there in the background. And by the end of that time of isolation, phone calls were typically, my mom would be there for the first sentence, and she would say, well, why don't you just talk to your dad? Because she couldn't follow the conversation anymore.
Yeah.
The other thing, though, that was also part of this and part of my awareness is that my mom and dad lived in their own home, still do, except, of course, my mom is dead now, but they lived in their own home through COVID, which meant that my mom and my dad were a pod of two.
Oof.
And my dad, who is mentally very sharp still, he followed all the news. He knew the world was unraveling. And his wife of 60 years was oblivious to it, could not understand why she had to wear a mask could not understand what all of this was about. And so for my dad as well, that period of isolation and separateness was very difficult. And I fretted, for myself, I fretted the time that I wasn't able to kind of savor those last conversational moments with my mom. And I fretted as well the cost that it was, that it was holding for my dad to navigate it pretty much on his own. We had a daughter, sister of mine, his daughter, who lived in Michigan City, who would go over there, and kind of those pods became permeable because my sister Deb knew that my dad needed somebody to check in on a regular basis. But it was a very unfamiliar, awkward territory to move through.
So you are navigating the encampments with your wife. You are navigating your mother's illness and your father's isolation, and you're writing. Did you find yourself making predictions during that time that have borne out, some that did not bear out? How does that look now with the gift of hindsight?
Yeah, I'm not sure that hindsight is a gift in this case. I reread some of those things before this conversation today, and I was struck by this essay that I wrote with it was audacious innocence, even though it was grim innocence. The first week of April, we are really just 1 month in to COVID deaths in the United States. The first recorded death was the very end of February. So we enter April 1st, with 32 days of COVID deaths, and it's 4,000. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I'm following the news closely like everybody does. And so I put in this...
Everybody does not follow the news.
Okay. I put it in this essay that I wrote the very first week of April. I said, not so much predicting as echoing the predictive knowledge of people that I trusted. I said, in essence, we are going to see 60,000 deaths in the month of April, right after we just had experienced 4,000. And I said, if this keeps up by the end of May, in 2 months, we will have eclipsed the worst 2 years of the AIDS epidemic, which for those of us living during COVID, AIDS was kind of the only other national epidemic that we could imagine. And they were almost grotesque predictions, but sure enough, by the end of March, we had 59,000 new deaths. And by the end of May, we had 100,000 COVID deaths, which surpassed the 82,000 AIDS deaths in the 2 most deadly years of the AIDS epidemic. And I remember in that essay, I kind of went through a laundry list of hurt. Now, the essay was titled Grief Upon Grief, and it was this notion that we have no idea what is coming our way. We can rehearse the numbers, but we can't feel the numbers in advance. And I wrote about the stress that it was going to place on families, on businesses, on careers, on the fraughtness of political divisions that could be amplified. And I would have to say in hindsight that sadly, virtually everything that I was worried about was worth worrying about.
And one of the reasons why, well, obviously I agree with you. I read the regs, I was like, yep. And then I thought, well, when people hear him speak about societal and ecological collapse, whatever collapse may end up looking like, I feel like it's beneficial to know that he made some predictions in the past and they were borne out. And so I'm like, oh, you better go to full frontal faith and like do some reading and see what we're in for if we continue on the path that we're on. But as an educator, I think you've probably come across this before. People need humor sometimes. If people will dissociate, people will start doing their taxes rather than talk about climate change or what have you. And so when I was reading through your works, I saw some of the titles. One of them I think is called like "Better World My Ass."
Yes.
Another one's like "Good Christian Racist." And I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
There's some humor in here. And I wonder about how often you find yourself like kind of consciously needing to inject humor to keep people's attention. Because if you lose people's attention, it's, we'll just be on the same path we're already on.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess I would say that maybe the first thing to say is that because the topics that I write about tend to be heavy topics, it is the case, I think, that overall my writing tilts dark. Maybe it doesn't even tilt dark, it races in the direction of darkness. And yet, because even when I'm writing about hard things, writing itself is joy for me. And particularly, I think more often in my personal life, I use words playfully. Now, granted, Margaret, my wife, is a bit of a captive audience, but she laughs a lot at things I say. So I know that I have a wit that can turn phrases, that can find fun in strange places. And so, like, for thinking about COVID in particular, there is one piece that I wrote. It's a satire in the middle of early in COVID. It was sometime in March, that was just titled "Breaking News, God Tests Positive." And the whole piece, 600 words or so, was written as a news story coming out of heaven with an angel making the announcement that God has tested positive, and there's this press conference and humans are asking questions, what does this mean? And while on one hand it was very farcical, on the other hand, I was using it to make the point that if God really means to keep solidarity with humanity, which is my understanding of what God's commitment is, it means that God is as vulnerable to what humans are experiencing as we are ourselves. And that somehow, if we can imagine a vulnerable God, that suggests that for us to be in the image of that God is to be vulnerable and is to show compassion. So it was a farcical news story that had a deeper purpose to it. The one that you mentioned, "Better World My Ass," it's a fun piece that I wrote about changing the world by changing your choice of toilet paper. And it talks about, kind of the foolishness of wiping our butts with toilet paper that is made from virgin tree harvest, and suggesting and sharing the experience from our household of using both recycled toilet paper and bamboo toilet paper, and suggesting, sometimes like how you change the world can catch you from behind. And so I find ways to do that. Now, the other one that I need to mention, because this is interesting. So part of an unexpected gift that I received from the years that I spent learning about and then teaching and talking about LGBTQ folks and their, in many ways, their spiritual struggles within the church, the unexpected gift was that I came to a much deeper appreciation of my own sexuality as a straight man, which is easy to kind of keep in the shadows because church doesn't target me for being straight. But for LGBTQ people, their sexuality is the very reason that they're targeted. And so if they're going to make the choice to stay in the church and hold their ground, they have to make the argument, why is my sexuality a point of my goodness and I shouldn't be condemned for it? And it opened a doorway for me into that. So for example, there was, but that continues to be a topic that is taboo and causes discomfort. So there was a time.
We won't be able, unfortunately, to get. I want more of it. We're going to have you back to talk about it. But there is an intersection between the LGBTQ community and Better Rolled My Ass, and I think that is bidets. So next time, we'll talk bidets. We'll be right back with more from David Weiss. Welcome back to Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. We are having an exquisite conversation with David Weiss. We've talked COVID, we've talked climate change, and we've got, I think, maybe to talk about how your writing might be helping to steer us in a different direction. Do you think about that at all? Is that present in Full Frontal Faith?
I do think about that, and interestingly, I would say the direction that I am trying to steer us is right into the storm. It's as though, because I don't think that we can avoid collapse at this point, I think it is possible to move into collapse with grace. And so I see in my writing, I think 4 themes, and they come up sometimes at random. I think moving forward, I like to present them with a little bit more regular coherence. So I think about 4 things. The first one is, I do think that we ought to pursue as much green and as little fossil fuel as we can in our lives. I think it's too late to stop collapse, but every accomplishment that we make lessens the severity of it.
Yes.
And at the personal level, every choice that we make, even though it doesn't make a dent in the big picture, it makes a dent in my sense of personal agency. So doing what we can is important. Second thing is live simply. And I think choosing to live simply is about choosing to break the appetites that have broken the planet. And at some point, those appetites are going to be broken by the planet. And so I say simplify now and beat the rush. And the third thing is link arms. Community is going to be more important than ever. It's going to be important both in how we meet the challenges, but also in how we summon up joy in the midst of collapse. And then lastly, and nobody likes to hear this, but it's the most important one, learn grief. We are a society that tries to turn away from grief and lament as often as possible. And you mentioned earlier about the way that you sense that empathy is at the heart of what I write about. Grief is the doorway to empathy when it comes to climate and collapse. We need to open ourselves to be able to feel the pain that is ravaging not simply us, but the whole natural world around us. And I really believe that there is power that will come from that, but we need to welcome that and embrace that.
Yeah, it's weird that we don't have a sense of shared vulnerability when it comes to climate change. It's like, oh, we are all collectively dissociating. And as I spoke with the gentleman, Dr. Spencer Scott, a while back, and he's a climate scientist. And he says dissociation is not a strategy that'll get us out of this climate catastrophe or help go in for the soft landing when it comes to collapse. How are you paying for this? I didn't see any ads on your website.
There are no ads on it. So full disclosure, like true love, the biggest sponsor of what I do is Margaret. Yeah. She cheerfully chooses to let her her income be the anchor of our household, and I live with the humility of knowing that she is the anchor of our household. So in that sense, Margaret is who made Frontal Faith a possible idea. Patreon is who keeps it going and makes it a reality every day. And so Patreon is this online platform. I know you use Patreon as well. It's this online platform that allows people to make monthly or annual pledges, almost like to public radio, to say, I believe in what you're doing and the content that you're creating. And so I have patrons that support me at as little as $2 a month, as much as $50 a month.
That's wonderful.
And it all gets bundled together. It provides a steady, modest but steady income stream and allows me to keep doing what I'm doing. So should anybody wish to sponsor me because of this conversation, you can go to patreon.com. You can find me either under my name, David R. Weiss, or under my title, Full Frontal Faith.
Awesome.
And I'll just tell you that I hope if anybody sponsors me because of this, that they find a way to let me know, because I'd like to know that Bottomless Coffee has helped me out.
And I think there are links on your website as well.
There are. Yep. There
Fantastic. I am so grateful for this conversation. This is wonderful. I'm glad I prepared the way that I did. Do you have a final message for our audience? One thing you want to make sure that people take away from the conversation? As an educator, I'm sure there were kids running out the door. You're like, don't forget this one thing.
Yes. So first, I will say thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity for this conversation. And I think my closing message, kind of coming back to where I started, is that I really believe that cultivating kind of courageous authenticity and honest vulnerability, which is what I do on my blog, is rich soil in which we can grow compassion and understanding and genuine human community. And whatever the future holds for us, we want to be held by community as that future unfolds. And
Wonderful.
That's where my work lies.
Hear, hear. Go support his work on Patreon. Thank you, David, again. And thank you all for tuning in. This has been Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. Come stream all of our episodes at bottomlesscoffeeshow.com. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.